You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 27, The Man from Texas. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Norman Lau.
Each week on Gene-ology, we examine material from the Roddenberry archives and trace the early days of Gene Roddenberry boldly going through the golden age of television.
For this week's show, though, we don't have a script, and we don't have a show for you to watch either, streaming or on physical media. We've got something really special. The series pitch for The Man from Texas, the earliest formal series pitch written by Gene Roddenberry that we've located in the Roddenberry archive. This is the beginning of Gene as a creator of television shows, except that this show never made it to a soundstage.
I'll be back with trivia in a moment, but first, Norman will let you know how you can reach us.
Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, here's Earl Green with this week's trivia.
Thank you, Norman. Everybody saddle up because we are riding into uncharted territory. Documents that could have led to the first series bearing the credit created by Gene Roddenberry, except that the show we'll be discussing here was never made. In past editions of Gene-ology, I've mentioned how rapidly Gene was rising through the ranks of TV writers. From 1954 through 1956, he was moonlighting as a TV writer while still working his day job at the LAPD. He immediately graduated to a staff writer position on the West Point series, produced by Ziv television programs for CBS, leapfrogging over the desperate uncertainty of being 100% freelance. The bad news is that West Point lasted only one season of 39 episodes, but the good news is that 10 of those 39 episodes were written or co-written by Gene. And, just in case you're just now joining us, our coverage of those West Point episodes here on Gene-ology revealed that most of those 10 scripts were really good, especially for a half-hour family viewing time show whose stories were also vetted by the Department of Defense. That's a fairly complex set of variables to navigate and an impressive body of work. It got Gene noticed. In 1957, Gene was offered a development deal with Screen Gems Television, an offshoot of Screen Gems' motion picture production studio. Having been set up as a discrete entity in 1948, the Screen Gems TV division found success in the early 50s with hit shows like Father Knows Best and The Adventures of Rin Tin Tin. Screen Gems was also a subsidiary of Columbia Pictures, so existing Columbia film shorts such as The Three Stooges were now available in syndication to individual TV stations. During its heyday from the late 50s through the early 70s, Screen Gems' library included Dennis the Menace, The Donna Reed Show, Gidget, Bewitched, The Flying Nun, I Dream of Jeannie, and even The Monkees and The Partridge Family. Screen Gems made inroads into the Canadian and Australian markets as well. Major TV talents spent significant portions of their early careers there. Future Batman producer William Dozier, Jackie Cooper having graduated from child actor to an adult working behind the scenes, I Dream of Jeannie and Heart to Heart creator Sidney Sheldon, and post-West Point Gene Roddenberry. We should note that this was not the first series proposal Gene was involved in, but it's the earliest for which there's formal series pitch documentation in the Roddenberry archives. It is known that while both Gene and Quinn Martin were both working regularly for Ziv Television, they teamed up to try to work out a series concept with the somewhat generic title of Junior Executive, though any paperwork generated by that collaboration is not in our archives, but some may exist elsewhere, such as the Ziv material housed at UW-Madison. Like any good writer, Gene did work elements of the unused junior executive pitch into his later work, specifically The Lieutenant. But The Man from Texas represents Gene's first step up to the plate to attempt to create his own show. Sam Houston, the Raven. Soldier, scout, adopted Indian, battlefield general, governor of 2 states, wanderer, president of a new republic, exile, and more. These are the people, the times, and the stories of Sam Houston. This is his life as he lived it. Gentlemen, at your request, I have researched the life and personality of Sam Houston and come away completely stunned. Like most people, I was aware the Raven was an interesting historical figure, but I was totally unprepared for the incredibly colorful personality and lifetime which revealed itself. In my career as a writer, I have never found another subject so perfectly suited to the requirements of television. Witness this. Spanning a period from the War of 1812 to the Civil War, Sam Houston was authentic hero, humanitarian, duelist, Indian agent, scholar, scout, battlefield general, lover. Name it, and you'll find the Raven actually did it. His looks, size, and personality are as perfect as his adventures. Over 6 foot 2 inches, as lean and strong as rawhide, a handsome extrovert with a strong sense of honor and a spellbinding way with both men and women, Indians and whites. This new series could not properly be called a Western, frontier adventure, or any other type show. The only word which comes to my mind is epic. I respectfully submit that the life of Sam Houston provides enough high excitement, action, and adventure to fill not only 39 half hours of television, but 10 times that amount. In my opinion, this is a unique opportunity to combine drama and authentic history at a level which can set a new pattern for dramatic television. Respectfully, Gene Roddenberry, September 7th, 1957. Since we're examining a series pitch document, we should be clear off the top that our usual format of observations and discussion, it's all going to run together as we just try to take it all in and react to this document that somehow never became a show. And we might pick things apart just a little bit and try to get inside the heads of the executives at Screen Gems who decided this isn't going to become a show. With a pitch document like this, you know there's some salesmanship going on. Gene's pitching not just 39 half-hour episodes, he is clearly putting forth the notion of several seasons of 39 half-hour episodes each. This is a man who knows what job security as a TV writer looks like, and he's going for it. I mean, good on him. The problem is that this could easily backfire on you. At this point in TV history, nothing, and I mean nothing, was given a series order for more than a single season at a time. For a relative newcomer to the business with a single season as a staff writer behind him, this might have been seen as Gene overplaying his hand, except that Gene continued to have a development deal to pitch new series concepts at Screen Gems, so obviously he didn't alienate anyone.
Okay, so Earl, so I'm kind of fixated on the 39 half-hour episodes because we just finished West Point. West Point was 1 season, 39 half-hour episodes. So that was the production schedule of a year, 39 episodes?
Yeah, that was the pattern for American television in the late 50s, was 39 episodes. You take 52 weeks of the year, you divide it by 13, you get 4. So you have 3/4 of the year taken up by 39 weeks of new episodes, and so there are only 13 weeks remaining for reruns.
Wow.
Because reruns were just beginning to be a thing at the time. Production doesn't always hew to the schedule of 1 episode a week, so you can bet that to make those 39 weeks of television, you probably had people working 45 weeks out of the year and getting an itty-bitty vacation before the next season, or before the next gig.
I mean, so it's safe to say then that advertisers probably worked really hard, in negotiations to get on these, because that's 39 weeks worth of consistent advertisement for your product.
Yes. And we're also still in that era where some advertisers would be the sole advertiser for a given show. Now, that started to come to an end thanks to the Dumont television network, which sold to multiple advertisers instead of a single advertiser in a single show. That model, even though Dumont did not last as a network, that model of advertising did get picked up by the other networks over time. But we're still kind of in the in-between here, where you do have single-sponsor shows. Especially with some of the Playhouse shows like, Alcoa Presents, or what have you. But multiple advertisers would gradually become the norm, especially going into the 60s, especially with the advent of hour-long dramatic television. Now, Gene's development deal might be seen as something of a sweetheart gig. Do some research, do some writing, pitch your show, except that while it did offer income, it didn't help your career prospects if you pitched a dozen ideas that didn't actually get made. Hollywood careers are built on two things: who you know and what your latest credit is. Gene was still in the early stages of accumulating credits and networking. For context, the Man from Texas pitch was dated nearly 4 months after The Drowning of the Gun episode of West Point, and 2 months after the first 2 scripts Gene wrote for the TV series Boots and Saddles, with those scripts dated in July. His first scripts for Have Gun Will Travel have already been completed by now, as this pitch document is dated just 3 weeks before the premiere of the first Have Gun episode that Gene wrote. At this point, Gene has written nearly 35 scripts for television, with others undoubtedly in the works, so it's not as if he's completely green, but the majority of his work has been for one company, Ziv Television, and his big objective now is to spread his work around and defeat the optics of being a guy who only Fred Ziv will hire, basically. It may also factor into things that the one studio for which Gene had done most of his work up to this point, well, we called it last week when we were discussing Harbor Command, Ziv wasn't exactly conceptually adventurous. We're doing a show about Army cadets, let's also do a show about Navy cadets. Harbor Command might as well have been Waterway Patrol, from the makers of Highway Patrol. And so I could see where Gene wanted to spread his wings in a way that the Ziv production model just was not going to accommodate.
I mean, we did feel that, in a sense, with some of the scripts. We could feel that he wanted to push like a bigger narrative, something that you could really sink your teeth in, but felt like he was, under the constraints of being part of the Ziv format for all intents and purposes. And we mentioned this not only on this show, but also on Standard Mission Log, that you have to know and understand like the constraints of the box before you can start pushing a little bit more and risking a little bit more to think outside the box. So obviously, Gene has taken a look at the landscape of television at this time, and we're going to go into a little bit now more of the landscape, the history of how the Westerns were starting to really develop and kind of like dominate the TV market of the time. I mean, they were a staple on television. And to Sam Houston's point, The Man from Texas, a lot of these Westerns featured either real historical characters like Wyatt Earp or fictionalized accounts of real historical characters because, again, either you have the historical factual data or books or novels or papers or an amalgamation thereof to be able to create these newer properties, of which, if you actually create your own property or your own new character, fictionalized character, you don't have to pay anyone any royalties or things like that, right? So you can, all the advertising dollars go to you. I wanted to mention something from Gene's pitch doc, and there's a question that I'm going to keep throwing out there. It's the same question, and after you, our listeners, hear these excerpts, you're going to ask yourself the same question. The question is, why not Sam Houston? So from Gene's pitch doc, where an ordinary man lives only one life, Sam Houston led a dozen. Son of a distinguished American family, adopted son of a Cherokee Indian chief, Indian agent, hero in the War of 1812, congressman from 2 states, governor of 2 states, resigning from both offices rather than yield integrity, a man who twice renounced civilization to live with the Indians, an envoy to Congress from the Cherokee Nation, hunter, trapper, wanderer, a co-author of the Texas Declaration of Independence and Constitution, brilliant battlefield general, twice president of the Texas Republic. He died in 1863. When the simple ring he wore was taken from his finger, inside was found engraved a single word, quote unquote, honor. Gene also goes on to say, one thing often said about Sam Houston is, quote, if he had not existed, we would have been forced to create him. The truth in this is particularly applicable to television. Houston's life embodies all the elements of drama, action, mystery, and strong central characterization, which are recognized as important ingredients for a top-rated television series. Again, the big question, why not Sam Houston? It's all right there. It's historical, and it's American. That's about as American as it gets, right?
Yeah, and it should be pointed out that if you go even a cursory glance on IMDb reveals that Gene may have been ahead of its time here, but Sam Houston has inspired films, a number of TV shows, and quite a few documentaries as well.
So I want to read a little bit of history here from Wikipedia. So the following is the 1957-58 network television schedule for the 4 major English language commercial broadcast networks in the United States. As in previous seasons, both CBS and ABC continued to add westerns to their schedule, filling prime time with as many quote-unquote odors. Have you heard that phrase before, odors? I have to believe that's oats, westerns, odors, right, Earl?
Right, because you feed oats to horses.
Right. In addition to several returning westerns, which the network retained on its fall 1957 schedule, ABC's new western series included Sugarfoot and Broken Arrow on Tuesday nights, Tombstone Territory on Wednesdays, Colt 45 on Fridays, and Maverick on Sundays. ABC, third in the network Nielsen ratings, placed its new western, Maverick, in a difficult time slot, Sunday night against 2 hit series, The Steve Allen Show on NBC and The Ed Sullivan Show on CBS. ABC aired Maverick 1/2 hour prior to the Allen and Sullivan programs. The strategy was designed to hook the audience before it fell into usual viewing habits. NBC, late to the Western format, also began plugging Westerns into its fall schedule. New NBC Western series debuting in the 1957-58 season included Wagon Train, The Restless Gun, and The Californians. Though one NBC executive insisted The Californians is not a Western, but a drama set in California in the 1850s. I bring that up because that very well may be where Sam Houston could have been saddled. Pardon the pun. Now, this is my note. From this article, there is a color-coded schedule. Yellow means that these shows were in the top 10 shows of the entire lineup and not just Westerns. And I'm going to highlight just the yellow-coded Westerns. And wait, there are 1 or 2 magenta ones, and those are all in the top 30 of all of the shows of the 1957-58 season. On Monday night on NBC, you had from 8 to 8:30, The Restless Gun, and from 8:30 to 9, Tales of Wells Fargo. Now, this is one of those episodes or series that is based on an actual, real Oklahoman native, Dale Robertson, as Wells Fargo Special Agent Jim Hartle, and it was based on an actual Wells Fargo detective, Fred J. Dodge. So, again, you can fictionalize a story based on real people. On Tuesday night, you had at 8:30 to 9, The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp. Okay, Wyatt Earp, a real, historical, heroic, to some, character, from actual American history. Tombstone, Arizona, we all know that. We've all seen that movie, Tombstone. We've all seen Kevin Costner's, well, most of us have seen Kevin Costner's Wyatt Earp, and we all know the different permutations of Wyatt Earp.
At the very least, you've seen The Spectre of the Gun.
I was just thinking about that. Wednesday night, NBC from 7:30 to 8, and we just mentioned that, Wagon Train. Now, Wagon Train is an American Western television series that aired for 8 seasons. Okay, 8 seasons, and its format attracted famous guest stars for each episode, as appearing as travelers or residents from the settlements of the regular cast who encountered them. Now, even though that this wasn't a yellow-coded show, it was still in the top 30 for the 57-58 season. Again, Wagon Train is probably one of the most long-lived Western series on television at the time, probably in history, and it still wasn't in the top 10. It was in the top 30. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring up Wagon Train is because, according to this article on Wikipedia, Wagon Train, they have cited as the series influencing the development of Star Trek, that Gene Roddenberry has been known to quote and pitched as the Wagon Train to the Stars, which we all know, and we've read that before. So, and Friday night, to close out the week, weekdays, I should say, or the weeknights, the Western Rawhide. Now, this is probably one of the most famous Westerns of all time. But here is where it really gets big. On Saturday night, some have attributed Saturday night as being the death slot. I don't think it was, basically back in 1957 or 58, because at 9:30 to 10 p.m. on Saturday night, you had Have Gun Will Travel. Ran for 6 seasons, 225 episodes, of which Gene will write 24. So we've already established another great Western, another great pedigree of Western there. And then back to back with that, 10 to 10:30 p.m., Gunsmoke. The longest running Western of all time on TV. I don't know what people are doing on Saturday nights, but I'm pretty sure a certain audience of a certain age from this to that is watching Have Gun Will Travel and Gunsmoke. Westerns. Both Westerns. And then later in 1958 had shows like The Texan. So was The Man from Texas. So there's just an argument that can be made as to why not Sam Houston. There are other shows that had to do with all of that territory of that whole Southwest. You had Maverick that was based there, The Lawman, Cheyenne, The Rifleman, Wanted Dead or Alive, The Rough Riders, even Zorro, which was pretty much New Mexico and California. Again, here's my question. Why not Sam Houston?
Well, and presumably Screen Gems had identified Houston as a historical figure of interest that you could base such a show on, because I got the impression from the wording of Gene's letter that leads off the document that he was tasked with researching Sam Houston and trying to see how you could build a television format around the character. Now, I have been doing a little bit of homework reading ahead a book called Art and Politics in Have Gun Will Travel by Kathleen L. Spencer, which we'll be talking about that book quite a bit when we get to Have Gun, which is not very far away. Here is a quote from that book. In the fall of 1959, there were 29 Westerns on the primetime schedule. Now, I think you can infer from that maybe as a genre, it got overexposed. You notice there are very few Westerns now. Mm-hmm. And they are rare enough that when one does pop up and it's done well, there's automatically some acclaim there. But of course, they're at least as much of a period piece with just as much production requirements as the science fiction series. So the Western has now become, if you're going to do it, it's not going to be cheap. At the time, you didn't have all of the area around Los Angeles completely developed. And so there were ranches that were set up as film locations, working ranches. But they were set up to be filmed because the Western was so prevalent. And so you had kind of an economy of scale with those resources on hand for that window of time while they lasted. The inference from Gene's letter is that he was asked by Screen Gems, look into Sam Houston. See if you think this would be viable to build a television show around him. There is a one-page character description that Gene wrote about Houston, and it includes this paragraph. His adventures matched his stature and personality. Each time he fought, he emerged the biggest hero of the conflict. When he was wounded, it was in the gravest possible manner. His friends loved him, his enemies hated him, with equal spirit. That almost makes me think, men want to be him, women want to be with him. From what Gene has written here, do you think any of his ideas, any of his character sketch for Sam Houston as a dramatic character, do you feel, Norm, that any of these end up being inherited by, say, a Christopher Pike or a James T. Kirk?
I think that in at least the pitch, I think that Gene is looking at crafting maybe what he has not yet seen on TV, and that is the inspirational leader. Someone who basically walks in with reputation preceding him and people saying, okay, this is the person that I'm going to follow into whatever situation, because wherever he goes, he knows how to get into a situation. He knows how to get out of a situation. And if something's going to happen to me, I want it to happen under his watch. I want it to happen under his leadership because it is a cause worth fighting for. And I think that that's very much indicative of a Christopher Pike or a James T. Kirk or any other captains, that follow, or any of the characters really that we get to see a little bit more later on, because there's an ideal there, right? And I think that that's something that it's important, to Gene's storytelling. It's like the central figure of a reputation beyond reproach. But where's the drama when it comes to a character like that? Well, it is finding those nuances in a character's backstory or history that challenges his reputation beyond reproach. So I think that it's interesting to have a larger-than-life figure, and it's even more interesting that you have this tie-in to actual history. So, again, why not Sam Houston?
By the same token, we also have the character sketch of more or less Sam's sidekick in his story, the character of Deaf Smith, described in the following words. Plainsman and hunter, immortalized in Texas history as Houston's chief army scout in the battles for Texas independence. Houston learned to rely much on Smith's accuracy of observation and judgment, as well as his considerable fighting ability. Now, as someone once said, some might define that as the role of a first officer. Perhaps not the emotionless aspect, though the mention of Houston's Native American foster father, and I'm going to try to say this correctly, Ulutika, being, and I'm quoting Gene's pitch here, peaceful rather than warlike. That also caught my attention, because it's easy to look at a character in the big damn hero mold and say, here's the future captain waiting to happen. But I'm also wondering if maybe we are seeing, perhaps spread across more than one character, elements of Spock waiting to happen. And I would argue, and I'm sure you'll remember this, we have been seeing, shall we say, baby Spocks showing up occasionally ever since The Secret Weapon of 117.
Well, there's definitely something here, in the DNA of at least what we've framed in Gene's work, especially Star Trek, as the ethos, pathos, logos equation. And I think it's responsible, I think, for a writer to not only challenge his lead character, but also have characters that are fragmentations of kind of like the devil's advocate, angel's advocate, so the character isn't just pigeonholed into always making the right decision because of course he's going to make the right decision. He's the central character. Now, that doesn't really lead a lot towards, really good moral storytelling. You want to be able to have this character weigh all the options. And the only way you're really going to do that is to give characters that we, the audience, gravitate towards, because we can never be the central character. We can never be the Austin Powers, right? Women love him and men want to be him. We can't be that character. We can get as close to possibly the sidekick characters, that represent, I think, the audience's participation in a way, just being able to feed off of their energy and feed off of their perspective, because they're a little bit more realistic than the main character.
And kind of backspacing over what I was asking earlier about, do you see the future captain here? What I started to realize the further I got into this document was that I do see an awful lot of Paladin. Kind of, or Gene's formulation of Paladin taking shape here. Now keep in mind, he's already written a couple of Have Gun Will Travel episodes at this point, at the very least. 2 of them. So it could be that there is a little bit of, mental cross-pollination happening here?
I think with kind of like the quote-unquote solitary character, on horseback, there's a lot that can be translated like into what Gene wants in a central character, where a horse or a ship brings in the philosophy of the moral of the hero, and that is in some way interjected into whatever situation that this character is in. And then once things are finally resolved, either through diplomacy or violence or both, Then said hero boards said ship and goes to the next town or planet. So it's already starting to form. And all the characters that interact with him can be either seen as people from that particular planet, crewmen, advisors, first officers. They're all starting to have their own place in his universe.
I'm going to read you page 3 of Gene's document. This is the whole page. And the reason I'm reading the whole page here is because this is extraordinary for 1957. Character growth. A byproduct of historical authenticity is the necessity for change and growth in the central figure, Sam Houston. Several advantages of this are readily apparent. It increases believability. It provides episode-to-episode interest and continuity. Perhaps even more important are the dramatic opportunities it offers. Because our series opens at the time in which Houston has already achieved maturity and has acquired considerable of his talents and reputation, the change we see will be gradual. Each new problem and struggle will see him strengthened slightly, molded to meet the next adventure. Like the living personality he was, Houston will make mistakes, regret them, learn from them. Physically, there will also be a slow, almost imperceptible change, the later episodes finding him with a trace of gray at the temples. However, again authentic, Houston remained vigorous and youthful, almost to his death.
You know what this reminds me of, Earl? Maybe you saw this too, and I'm not sure. It's just too bad that Gene couldn't have pitched it this way. This reminds me a lot of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles.
That is something that is very much on my mind here, because I have thoughts about what Gene is asking for, and whether or not it is a realistic request on his part, because, of course, I'm sure that he is... Whenever you're writing a pitch document, you are proposing not just a show. There's also kind of a soft ask in there, can I also be in charge of my own show? Because having created it, that would be the most logical choice. So, on the subject of continuity, I know you and John have been wrestling over on Mission Log with Star Trek Voyager's frustratingly infrequent flirtations with serialization. And here we have Gene, years before creating Star Trek the original series, arguing for at least some serialization in his TV storytelling, and even allowing for whoever the lead actor of this show might have been to age naturally. In Hollywood, occasionally, aging is kind of a dirty word to even have to deal with. And yet, of course, Gene being Gene, he's also leaving enough wiggle room for future stories to show us that, for lack of a more delicate way to put it, as the kids say today, Sam Houston can still get it. Part of me thinks there's some endearing naivete here, or perhaps a bit of a rookie understanding of how the business works, because all the way into the early 2000s, it was standard practice to avoid serialization in most American TV, with the major exception being daytime soaps. The conventional wisdom of the TV business was that ideally, if you could keep a show running long enough to produce 100 episodes or more, that show could be sold into strip syndication to run 5 days a week on your local stations. And because satellite distribution didn't become cheap enough to be common until the early 90s, you were at the mercy of our old friend, we've mentioned this a long time ago, the system of stations bicycling film cans and videotapes to one another. There was no guarantee that episodes would necessarily arrive in the correct order, or really intact for that matter. So the conventional wisdom was, don't lose the audience, keep it simple. If this is the only episode the audience has ever seen, make sure they are not lost. Every episode had to be a complete story from beginning to end, and I think this is also why, in shows of this vintage, like we have already seen, you frequently have narration over the opening titles. And it's not something flowery like Space the Final Frontier. It's just coming right at you saying, these are the men of West Point.
I think it goes without saying that reruns didn't exist. Obviously physical media, the way we know it, didn't exist. So there's no real way for the audience, like if they missed Saturday night, they're not going to go anywhere to be able to say, like, well, I missed that episode of Have Gun Will Travel. I hope that I didn't miss what Paladin did from last episode to this episode, because it didn't matter. Because they can't rewatch it anyway, right?
Right. And so the conventional wisdom is it just wasn't done.
Right.
So Gene may have been reaching for something beyond what any studio head would have been willing to grant him. We've already seen in some of Gene's scripts that populating his stories with ideas and characters that were ahead of their time. But here he's putting a production idea out there decades ahead of its time. That's what I find, frankly, kind of amazing here. He had the stones to push for serialization in primetime westerns in 1957. At a time when, the way things that worked in television production, and especially television distribution, didn't allow for that. But getting back to your mention of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, this is where I wondered if Gene's request kind of doesn't make sense here, because he's arguing for Huston to accumulate experiences and wisdom with age. But he also very specifically said the character is to start the series. He's already the fully formed hero of legend. When you're already a legend, how much growth is really possible from that starting point? How much can you realistically learn?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I saw something similar to this, after reading the script and seeing some issues with the overzealousness maybe of Gene's vision here. So going back to his pitch, and forgive me if I'm being a little redundant here, for the audience, but I just want to make this point. So Gene said the time he, Sam Houston, lived in, the varied locales of his adventure, and the people he knew are nearly as exciting as the man himself. So perfectly is the life of Sam Houston tailored to the requirements of television, it would be a sheer waste of good material to fictionalize it. It is doubtful that any writer, however capable, could come up with stories half as good, or half so good. For this reason, historical authenticity will key and guide this series. No legends need be created. Sam Houston actually lived his legend. Except for necessary dramatic capsuling and bridging, each episode will be wholly factual. Now, from my observation, there is a great amount of detail in Gene's pitch. It dwarfs in every possible definition his pitch for Transporter. Transporter was a paragraph. This is a pitch in total, like in earnest. And it chronicles and describes Sam's history, his life and career, other actual historically important characters as well, who are going to be part of the makeup cast. The level of detail that Gene puts into their descriptions as well, they read like biographies that were incredibly well researched. Now, getting back to your point, here's my big question. If Gene truly believed that Sam Houston's life and the details of his history and career were so fascinating, then what kind of maneuvering room would Gene have to infuse his own story into a half-hour format show? Let's be honest, 26, maybe 27 minutes, right? How's he going to be able to get his own creativity in that if you don't have to rewrite the events of Sam Houston's life, right? So would this have eventually become an issue where here's the facts, and that's 26 minutes worth of storytelling, but I have to put my own creative spin on it too. So where does that Venn diagram cross, and how would Gene have responded to that? Or was basically saying, Sam Houston is my moral compass of a character, and using his history gives me the opportunity to put that type of moral compass, my moral compass, on the map, on TV. And everything that I write for this character, because it exists in history, makes my character that much better in terms of how the audience perceives a character like this. Because no character, according to this pitch, should exist in history, and yet he does. So again, why not Sam Houston?
As far as what kind of wiggle room that would have left Gene to work messaging into his stories, that I don't know. And this really kind of leads to my feeling that perhaps once this project did not sell, once Screen Gems politely turned him down and said, but keep looking for something else, I feel like Gene may have realized, okay, the grass is actually greener on Paladin's side of the fence than on Sam Houston's, because Paladin is not a historical character. He has some historical antecedents. He may occasionally run into known people from history in his fictional stories, fictionalized version of those people. But Paladin himself is created out of whole cloth, so the writer can put their values into Paladin's mouth without compromising anything, whereas eventually it just seems like a purely historical character, such as Sam Houston, you eventually would have wound up between that rock and that hard place. All right, Norman, I know that as we were both studying this document, I encouraged you to kind of take the studio head view of it, to look at things that a studio bean counter would see as being too much of a potential expense, but to also look at the upside potential, the story potential. Would this have found an audience, do you think?
Well, I mean, that's why I went into deeper research earlier on as we talked about just the proliferation of Westerns on TV. Now, as you said, from quoting the author from the Have Gun Will Travel book, 29 Westerns, dominated the scene around 1959. And they were kind of slowly building up, that library of Westerns starting in like 1956, 57. As the Westerns started getting more successful, obviously, network C, network do, you're going to have to either compete or you're going to lose that market share to other networks, who obviously you're all vying for the same marketing dollars out there because there's just so many to go around. So like the Texan, for example, well, Sam Houston was a Texan. There was also a Western called The Texan that pretty much was a direct lift, if you will, of Have Gun Will Travel. A Texan goes from town to town to town, finding himself into situations that he has to find himself out of. That's, in a nutshell, what Paladin was doing. And it's a Texan doing it. So there you have the actual examples of what Sam Houston could have been based on actual history. But everything comes down to dollars and cents, right, Earl, in television production.
Always.
Is it going to make the money back? How much are you going to have to invest? What is your upfront cost going to be? Are you going to be able to work with the talent at the time? Is there actually somebody out there who was the Sam Houston, and how much would this actor cost? How much would all these things cost? So all of that has to obviously go into the equation. But the thing is that Gene's pitching this in 1957, again, before the explosion of Westerns on every network, before the oversaturation, probably when it hit its peak around 1960, 1961. So there was a chance. It's unfortunate that we don't have kind of like the follow-up documentation as to why the chance wasn't taken. Because obviously the opportunity was there, the character of history was there, the real-life events were there, the stories were there, probably has Sam Houston's journal or several, that's there. Everything's there, so why didn't it happen? That's the big question, right? Why not Sam Houston?
There is a lot of potential here. Gene identified numerous incidents from Houston's life and a number of colorful and, in many cases, real historical characters. He did note that some of these characters would be composites of real people. And, of course, you do that in television to keep the number of speaking parts down, because that is going to be more of a primal consideration than historical accuracy. But all of these characters with whom Sam Houston could have crossed paths on TV, one thing that occurred to me is that if he had been able to get this show off the ground and stay aboard as its producer, or what we would now call the showrunner, if Gene had stuck to his guns, this could have been quite an educational show, as well as entertaining. One thing that did stick out immediately, Gene's formulation of Sam Houston's life story, and let's be clear, this was bolstered by the facts that he had researched about Houston's life. Did you notice that Gene was including citations?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like he was writing a college paper.
But that's what I mean, though. He has this incredible, volume of source material that he's basing this pitch off of. It's all there. It kind of practically writes itself.
Yeah, it does. But something that worries me, and this is a very postmodern concern, it would not have been a consideration at the time. This show would have been putting forth the notion that white men had not done the Native American tribes any favors. The First Nations characters in Gene's document run the gamut from noble to deeply flawed. In fact, there's one that's treacherous. Backstabber. It's a fascinating cross-section of humanity, as every ethnicity is. And I'm of two minds about the story treatment of this. Part of me wonders if the American primetime viewing audience of the 1950s was ready to consider uncomfortably honest questions about what had happened to Native Americans at the hands of white settlers and colonizers of European descent. I mean, hell, there are some people who shift uncomfortably in their seats if you ask them to consider having that conversation now. And yet, Houston, in the historical background that Gene has researched so extensively, is often using his unique position to ask the Native Americans to make nice with the white man. I see both mind-boggling leaps in what Gene is trying to do on television in this era, and yet I also see the limitations of history and kind of a disappointing default to the status quo of 50s TV waiting to happen, which is white man in charge. From our vantage point in the 21st century, I'm also wondering who wrote the histories upon which Gene relied for his research for this project. Was it anyone armed with real knowledge of the events? Or, as often happens, non-native authors trying to burnish the image of the victors? And this is a particular interest. The reason this was in my head was because of our recent discussion of the Voyager episode Living Witness in the Mission Log Discord. And, by the way, dear listeners, you can see or hear that whole discussion by joining the Mission Log Patreon, even at the free level. We've made that available for everyone. If you want to pitch in $1 or $2, though, you can be in the Discord with us for the next scintillating discussion. So, these are kind of my concerns with, perhaps more with how the show would have come across in hindsight than in real time. I doubt that would have been a consideration for Screen Gems, because every Western was, to some extent, a little bit guilty of that. Now, we keep on bringing up Have Gun Will Travel. I think Have Gun Will Travel does a very good job of really starting to honestly address some of these issues as much as it can get away with, both in the length of its episodes and with what the networks will allow. Because, of course, the sponsors can rattle the producer's cage and say, hey, that thing you were talking about in this latest episode, let us never speak of this again. We don't want that discussed if we're going to keep sponsoring. Which brings me really to this point. At the same time that Gene was working on this pitch, he was also writing for Have Gun Will Travel. Paladin is a completely fictional character operating in almost the same historical time period. I think the fact that Paladin is not a historical character, or is not based on any one single actual person, living or dead, as the boilerplate disclaimers say, that unties Gene's hands and frees him enormously in the area of issue-based storytelling. Have Gun is even more progressive than the historical record would ever have allowed a Sam Houston show to be. So Gene may not be the great bird of the galaxy yet, but he is a pretty wily bird, because a lot of the historical research lends itself to ideas, story ideas, that he could carry over to this other show. And so, nothing is wasted. It's clear that Gene's got some issues he wants to put before the audience, but trying to do that without a historically accurate, with minor allowances for drama, format probably would not have been the best fit, and I think the best fit was continuing to work more and more for Have Gun Will Travel.
I think that looking at like Gene's overall pitch and the way that he, in exacting detail, had all of these different characters, First Nations characters of varying non-white backgrounds. And I think that's probably the one thing maybe network executives was looking at as a potential problem when it came to this show, because I wouldn't say there would be pushback from the audience perspective. There may have been pushback from the advertiser's perspective. Definitely pushback from how you're going to distill these moral messages into this story that has to do with a real historical figure. And if it is in fact based on actual events from an actual historical heroic figure, then you actually have the leverage of telling the story that you believe should be told because you have the defense of history, right? But then again, you bring up that good point. Whose history is he using as the defense?
Uh-huh.
So there is a little bit of the potential of that kind of whitewashing that they're going to lean on in terms of the reference points. But at the same time, though, I really don't think that, the powers that be in the 1950s were really cognizant of that particular social convenience or inconvenience, however you want to see it from the network standpoint. So I see that as probably the only real stumbling block, is that every week you're going to have Sam Houston engage with characters that are diverse, characters that are meaningful for the story, characters that probably have a positive impact and a positive spin on a situation that perhaps history didn't agree with, or a situation that these characters were put in that empowered them as these diverse characters in a way that wasn't comfortable for the audience to accept. That's the only real reason why I can see the network executives saying, you know what, I think this is just too inflammatory for us. We have seen later on in The Lieutenant, an inflammatory episode that pretty much buried that series in terms of Gene's eyes. And we're going to get to that when we get to The Lieutenant in specific, because it is one of the best episodes of that series. But if we extrapolate how people felt then, what was it, 1964?
Yeah.
Versus 1957, that there is still a body of the powers that be that would rather find other alternatives than to create a confrontational product, especially when it comes to the advertisers. So that's the way I saw it in Gene's pitch. I'm like, you know what? There's no reason why this show shouldn't be on. History itself, in terms of the programming, shows that this show should be on. But there's something behind the scenes, I think, that is far deeper than we'll probably ever realize unless we actually interviewed somebody from that period of time.
Right. One other thing that I thought of going through his pitch document is he has all of this extensive research. I mean, just an astounding amount of research for a series pitch. But he does not pick out specific incidents and say, this could be an episode. It's just kind of an info dump. Now, you fast forward to March of 1964, the famous Star Trek Is document, which was the pitch document for the original series. At the end of that document, there are specific story ideas for episodes, and they even have titles, like The Next Cage, or The Day Charlie Became God. And, of course, we all know from those we got The Cage and The Menagerie, and we got Charlie X. Here, there's just this info dump of historical incident. Not much evidence that he had thought of, okay, episode 1 is going to be this historical episode, this historical incident. Episode 2 will be this incident. And that might almost look like perhaps a lack of foresight, a lack of planning. Of course, these days you go into pitch a series, you've got to have your whole season mapped out at the pitch level. That was not a requirement back then. That was not something that anyone thought to ask for back then. Because you're doing 39 weeks of TV, chances are you're not going to do something absolutely crazy and write all of them yourself. So they're looking for the framework, they're looking for the scaffolding, and then they're going to build onto that. But without mentions of this incident, this incident, this incident, these could be episodes, you don't even have the scaffolding. And so I think there is a Perhaps the very hard lesson that Gene was learning here was how to write the pitch.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, Destiny and the Raven. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David DeCacci.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.